Today on the Perception and Action podcast, does more representative practice design lead to better transfer of training? Does it make an athlete more adaptable and strategic in their play? What is the relationship between the CLA and representative design? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception and Action podcast, back with another article review. For this, I want to talk about the issue of representative design, something I've talked about quite a few times on the podcast before. Back in 133, back in episode 88, I kind of introduced the concept when talking about the constraints-led approach. And back in 133, I talked about some of the new research that has evaluated it. Today, I want to, instead of reviewing a brand new article, I want to go back to a really important one from 2019. This was an article that is one of the few studies that have actually evaluated the effect of different levels of representativeness on transfer of training, rather, the outcome of practice. The basic assumption we're working on with here, right, is the more representative the practice is, the better outcomes you're going to get of training, right? You're going to get better transfer of training, you should get better adaptability, retention, et cetera, so on, right? So what I want to do is talk about the study by Krause and colleagues from AIS that actually evaluated this in a systematic way. So the basic background I think most people know is that, there's been this kind of movement against traditional practice, which often doesn't allow for an athlete to become, learn to be functional and adaptable, make decisions, solve problems, right? Because practice tends to have low representativeness, right? We tend to isolate skills, decompose them. In tennis, an example would be having a coach soft toss a ball to you, while underhand it to you while you return it into an empty court, hitting off tees, dribbling around cones, etc. We're decomposing the skill. The basic logic of that coaches have held to for a long time is that it's easier to control and helps you learn the quote-unquote fundamentals of the movement better than if we put it in its actual context, right? And this idea, a lot of people, including myself, have had problem with because it kind of takes away, a lot of important things an athlete needs to develop. And the idea that you can decompose and have a low representativeness, isolate things, and then plug them back in is really not really been demonstrated, right? It's a kind of an assumption, but it's really not been supported. So the idea is to have more representative practice, right? And representative learning design is a concept, as I said, I've covered on the podcast a few times. The idea here is not to perfectly recreate practice, right? Recreate the game in practice, right? You don't have to have everything there. There's just some key features that you need there. Beyond that, you can change, right? Obviously, that as I said before, you don't want to just copy the game in practice or just let them. Why wouldn't you just let them play? There's certain things you want to change as a coach to create affordances, to get an athlete to explore. So you are going to have it differ from the game. But in representative learning design, we want to keep some of the key features we think are critical there. And in the paper, they lay these out nicely. The first one is coupling, right? We want to keep perception and action coupled. We want you to move based on information, right? And, use, not just use information and not move, right? Which a lot of the practices, decomposed practices, do one of those two things. We want to adequately sample information variables that are there in the competition. So we don't want you doing fake agility where you move around a piece of rubber on the ground. We want you to move based on your opponent, right? So that we want you driven by, as Gibson called, specifying information. We want you to have your movement characteristics similar, the constraints on your movement. For example, time is one that is a big one. A lot of low representative designs give an athlete forever to respond, right? So if you're just making a verbal response to where a kick is going, for example, there's no time limit on that, right? Even if I posed a time limit of 1 minute, that's unrealistically long, right? So we want the constraints and the movement characteristics to be similar to what you're going to face in competition, right? If you have to make a movement really quickly, you need to do that in practice too. That sometimes falls under the umbrella of action fidelity. And the fourth one that these authors, typically include in representative learning design, we don't always include, is the idea of having practice hot, right? Hot, I don't mean temperature, I mean in terms of arousal, right? You're having similar pressure, similar emotional responses, similar level of anxiety, not having practice cold where there's no consequences. The athlete is not, and I've talked about this on the podcast before. So those are the characteristics of representative learning design. So in this study, what they wanted to do was to look at the effect of training with different levels of representativeness on transfer in tennis, right? So they're going to look at 6 weeks of training, and they're going to have 3 different levels of representativeness. And what they're going to use is a tool that they developed called the Representative Practice Assessment Tool, which is a way to quantify how representative a practice session is, right? And they're going to have these 3 conditions. And the basic prediction they're going to make, so after training, they're going to evaluate a skills test where you're just serving into an empty court at targets, and they're going to look at your play and match play. And what they're expecting is that, in particular, so the training is about learning to serve, right? And what they're going to expect is basically the higher the representativeness, the more functionality and adaptability in your serving, right? So if you're just using isolated serving drills, you should focus on, one particular aspect of it, probably focusing only on speed. Whereas if you're learning more in context, you're going to serve to try to score a point, right? To try to move your opponent around, go against their weaknesses. So you're going to have, serve's going to be much more functional and adaptable rather than just trying to blast a really strong serve, which is what you'd probably learn just focusing on technique, right? So when you have low representative practice, you're probably going to not be as adaptable to your opponent as if you have higher representative. And that's the basic prediction of this paper that they wanted to test. So to do this, they took 36 junior tennis players that were within the Australian state level system. So they were all players, currently fairly skilled players. They did a pre-test of the skill test and match play, a 6-week training session, and then a post-test of skills and match play. Okay, and in the match play they assessed They used a questionnaire and assessment tool to assess kind of a performance. So that was kind of the basic design. As I mentioned, they used this tool called the Representative Practice Tool. And if you look up, this is a really nice study that they did. I think I was a part of this actually in developing this tool. I was one of the people they questioned. They asked a lot of coaches and kind of academics and skill acquisition to kind of help develop this tool. But it's basically a tool a coach can use to evaluate a practice session in terms of, what it includes, what's there, what's not. And they have if you want to look at the original paper, I think it's an excellent tool. And it actually comes up with a score of how representative your practice is of the competition, right? So it's asking things like, does the task encourage decision-making? Is the athlete striking the ball and moving? Is the ball being fed, or is it hit by an opponent? So on and so on. So this one is specific to tennis, but you can have one specific to other sports as well. All right, so for the 3 different conditions they evaluated with this tool. Okay, I mentioned there was a skills test along with match play, where skill test you were trying to serve into particular parts of the service area. Okay, in the skills test. In terms of the match play, they measured a variety of different parameters of movement. They were, tracking people, so they measured serve speed, location, points won, angle, how variable you were on your serve location. So another prediction they had was that the more representative practice design would lead to more variability in the serves, right? You'd be more adaptable and adjustable. Okay, so they did all that. The 3 conditions, as I mentioned, were 6 weeks. This equated to about 56 serves across the intervention. So the lowest group was the SO, called SO, which got a 39 score on the representative scale. They're basically serving into an empty court, right? So there's no opponent there. The SR group was 58 out of 70. They were serving into a court with an opponent, but the opponent returned the serve, then immediately stopped. So they weren't playing a point, right? The last condition was the most representative. They got a 70 out of 70. Here they're making a serve to start a point, right? So they're serving and they're going to rally afterwards, right? So it's coupled, it's within context, right? And so on, right? So those are the 3 conditions: SO, SR, S3. And you can look at the naming convention in the paper if you want. But so you can see they vary in terms of representativeness of the actual game of tennis. What did they find? Okay, so they looked at a variety of these different variables. And what they found, basically, to sum it up, there wasn't a simple story. There wasn't a simple relationship between the level of representativeness and the behavior of the players, right? Instead, they found there was much more nonlinear, right? There was some players did some things, some did the others. It really depended on the situation. So there was not a simple case that, the higher representatives led to more variability or more location. There was effects like this where they found that in the second serve and match play, people that practice more representative tend to take something off the serve more, right? Instead of and try to location. So there was some evidence that the more representative practice led to more kind of strategy in terms of the serving, in terms of, thinking about how this serve fits into the point rather than just focusing on the technique and hitting it as hard as possible. There was some evidence of that, but it was not like a clear, consistent pattern at all. Okay. As I mentioned, the variability was actually higher in the lower representative group, so that prediction wasn't maintained at all. So there was some, as I said, it was very kind of a nonlinear relationship. There wasn't this simple relationship. High representativeness leads to more adaptability. That simple prediction was not confirmed. The other important thing they found was that really the skills test, not surprisingly, gave a completely different story than the match play, right? The differences between the groups in terms of using speed and location and variability was different if you looked at the skills test results versus the match play results, which they make the important point that, skills tests are very limited, right? When you're just looking at someone serving into an empty court, it doesn't really tell you much about playing the actual game of tennis. Right, so I think this paper, it's a really interesting study. I think it's well designed. Like they measured a lot of different things. I would suggest you have a look if you're interested more and look at all the variables they measured. But I think it really makes, and they bring out the point in the discussion, I think it makes the important point that, right, there's a lot more to practice design than being representative, right? Being representative is the start, right? We want to have these key things there, coupling, specifying information, action fidelity. We want to have those there, but in terms of actual outcomes like adaptability, strategy, whether a player is serving to take advantage of their opponent, then we're getting into constraints, right? We're getting into understanding the constraints and how a coach manipulates the constraints. So for me, effective coaching is, representativeness is the base, and then building on it with the constraints or differential learning or something like that, where you're trying to understand how your practice design is influencing a particular aspect of serving, right? If you want to get an athlete to spread the ball around more in terms of location, be more variable, then you can achieve that with a specific constraint in practice, right? It's more than just being representative, right? So I think representative design is the base on which you build with constraints and differential learning and things like that. So I think this study shows this nicely. Like representative design it does not mean you're going to have this perfect, predictable outcome, which we don't expect with a complex system anyway, right? Representative design, you should get better transfer outcomes, which there's some evidence of this. And the studies I reviewed before, you see that as well. There's some good work by Ian Renshaw, for example, in cricket, showing you do get better training outcomes with more representative designs. But it's not just a simple pattern, right? And you need to think about how your practice design is going to influence the outcomes that you want in practice, right? So I think that's an important, and I think these kind of evaluation of these kind of basic ideas like of representative design are important, and I hope to see more of this kind of work. But as I said, it's a very interesting study and a very well quantified with that tool, assessment tool, and things like that. So that's it for today. This episode. Thank you very much for listening. If you got some value for this and found it useful, please consider kind of supporting the podcast, where you can go to patreon.com/perception action. Thanks for joining me, and cheers for now. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.